All right. I want to welcome you. We are going to be going over chapter 34, and this is going to be more the Cliff's Notes version of our content for what we're going over here. The very first thing as we get into chapter 34, you need to kind of understand the relationship between the United States and what is taking place here with Britain and Russia. You see the big three pictured here, and then you see the black boxes there. The black boxes will help answer the questions that we're trying to get nailed into your brains. And so, what is this weird relationship? Are we actually in a good place, in a good relationship with Russia? And the answer is essentially no. We still don't agree with their communist government, their communist lifestyle, the fact that Stalin is himself a fascist dictator of sorts. However, sometimes in American history, frequently in American history, we have come to agree that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so, therefore, why did we engage in a relationship with the Soviet Union? And why did we finally, after so many years of refusing to, why did we finally recognize the Soviet Union? And the answer to that is we were trying to engage in a diplomatic counterweight to the rising power of Japan and Germany. Okay? We're trying to balance that power out. So that becomes an important element as we move forward here. We've already talked through some of these things in class, and so I am going to skip quite a bit of information here. You do want to kind of see the textbook information as they will be randomly throughout these slides. And so just kind of be cognizant of those things as we move forward. The textbook tells you that, like Roosevelt, Hull believed that trade was a two-way street, that a nation can only sell abroad as it buys abroad, that tariff barriers choke off foreign trade, and the trade wars beget shooting wars. And so, therefore, he is going to engage in the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act in 1934. Moving forward, though, why did Roosevelt embark on the good neighbor policy? Now, this becomes a really great question for us historically, and this is something that you should be pretty well aware of. So, what is the good neighbor policy? First off, the good neighbor policy is a foreign policy attitude towards Latin American countries. And so what we mean by that, we're talking about our relationships with nations in the Caribbean, with Mexico, with everything into South America and Central America. Okay, we're going to engage in a good neighbor policy, and essentially what we're doing is we're trying to make really good friends. Okay, now why would we want to make really good friends in Latin America? Well, we're trying to enlist Latin American allies that can help defend the Western Hemisphere against the dictators that are going to be rising up with the Axis powers. If you guys can kind of think back to FDR's uncle, Teddy Roosevelt, he had the big stick diplomacy, right? Big stick policy. And that, in essence, was us kind of going around being a bully. The problem is that ended up sowing a bunch of bad seeds in our relationships with these Latin American countries. And if you remember, World War I, our involvement in World War I was very much brought on by uncovering some secret communications between Germany and Mexico. And Germany was, in essence, prior to World War I, trying to get Mexico to attack the United States to keep the United States on this side of the pond. That way, we wouldn't ever get involved in the European war. But essentially what's happening here is we're trying to make sure that that does not happen, that this doesn't end up being a Western Hemisphere type of war, that these guys stay here on this side and they end up being our friends rather than our potential enemies. So we're trying to treat them well during this, all right? Let me get into some of this other stuff. We've talked about some of these fascist dictators of sorts, Mussolini and Hitler, and the Rome-Berlin axis, the relationship developing between those two. And then eventually that developed into the Tripartite Pact, which adds Japan into that relationship. But what's now going to start happening here is that you're going to see the rise of fascist aggression. Okay. Now, what kind of fascist aggression are we talking about? You'll see the black box up there. Fascist aggression in the 1930s included Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, which you can kind of see here on the screen. Okay, Ethiopia had previously repelled an attempted invasion by Italy prior to Mussolini's taking over the country. But what's also going to be happening here is we have Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. All right. And we have Franco's overthrow of the Republican government of Spain. So we see that all three of these are cases in which you see fascist aggression that is going to be leading essentially to what we would eventually call World War II. All right. What's happening here? We are signing neutrality acts of 1935, 1936, 1937. All right, and these neutrality acts are essentially us trying to do our best to stay out of this war. Now, why would FDR be doing that? Well, it's essentially because the United States genuinely desired to stay out of war. You see, the black box there says throughout most of the 1930s, the American people responded to the aggressive actions of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And your answer there is by retreating further into isolationism. Okay, so because we're heading more towards isolationism, the hotter that war over there gets, the government's going to respond in kind. But there is going to come a point where FDR is absolutely fully believing that we have to get involved, and we actually need to get involved sooner rather than later. But what we're basically doing here is we're trying to correct the mistakes that caused our entry into World War I here. And it is going to be an important thing as we kind of move forward. All right. Let me see here. All right, I can skip some of these things because these are issues we want to talk about in class. Let me move my picture screen over here real quick. America's neutrality during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 and 1939 allowed what? Okay. Well, if you can kind of see what's happening on the screen here, and there's a part of this. It's a quote from your textbook. It says, "Uncle Sam thus sat on the sidelines while Franco, abundantly supplied with arms and men by his fellow dictators, strangled the Republican governments of Spain. The democracies, including the United States, were so determined to stay out of war that they helped to condemn a fellow democracy to death. In so doing, they further encouraged the dictators to take the dangerous road that led over to the precipice of World War II." So what did American neutrality with the Spanish Civil War allow? Well, it allowed Spain to become a fascist dictatorship. Okay, it allowed Spain to become a fascist dictatorship. And should we have gotten involved? Well, we're in the middle of a huge isolationist mindset in this country. We did not want to get involved in Spain's civil war. But Hitler, Mussolini, these guys, they didn't mind getting involved in the Spanish Civil War because they see Francisco Franco as somebody who is like-minded to themselves. Had we gotten involved, we actually can keep a democracy in Spain rather than letting it fall and be toppled over by a fascist dictator like Franco. I would also tell you that if you were to read the book For Whom the Bell Tolls, you would see exactly how close that war was and how very little help was required from the United States to keep that very thing from happening. Let me get in here. A couple other black boxes here, all right? In September 1938 in Munich, Germany, we had the Munich Conference of 1938. What essentially happened here? Well, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, the guy you see here shaking hands with Hitler, is going to engage in a process or in a policy called appeasement, in which he is going to basically give Hitler what he's been doing and okay what he's planning on doing in exchange for peace. This appeasement policy is essentially going to be allowing some things to happen. So in this conference, Britain and France consented to Germany's taking of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. All right. And so therefore, you see the second black box here in 1938, the British and French bought peace with Hitler at the Munich conference by effectively handing over the nation of Czechoslovakia. All right. And so we kind of see that both answers, both questions are essentially asking the same thing. Who's the real loser in this? Well, most immediately is Czechoslovakia. But in the long term, what we did is, with Chamberlain's appeasement actions, he caused Hitler to get more and more and more bold. And just like you see the other man in the picture there, that is Ribbentrop, Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. And Ribbentrop's going to push Hitler further and further and further into more dangerous and more dangerous and more dangerous and more bold actions. And the more bold Hitler got, the more invincible he felt. And the more invincible he felt, the bigger his army got. And so pretty soon, instead of stomping out a monster that was easily defeatable in 1938, we end up kicking this thing down the road, and we end up having a huge, gigantic, awful war that's going to cost a lot of lives. It's at this point that you see a new rising star in Britain in Winston Churchill, who's going to be speaking out against Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. And this is one of my favorite all-time quotes, whether it be Churchill or anybody else, but this is a great Churchill quote. He says, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and now you will have war." And that quote ends up being pretty pivotal moving forward in understanding what's taken place here. The textbook material you see here quoted on the screen, let me move that back over again. Says the notorious Hitler-Stalin Pact meant that the Nazi German leader now had a green light to make war on Poland and the Western democracies without fearing a stab in the back from the Soviet Union, his communist arch-foe. Consternation struck those wishful thinkers in Western Europe who had fondly hoped that Hitler might be sicked upon Stalin so that the twin menaces would bleed each other to death. It was as plain as the mustache on Stalin's face that the wily Soviet dictator was plotting to turn his German accomplice against the Western democracies. The two warring camps would then kill each other off and leave Stalin bestriding Europe like a colossus. What this is referencing here in the Hitler-Stalin Pact, okay, is some really twisted stuff, okay? Like, even though they're supposed to be mortal enemies and whatnot, Hitler and Stalin are going to sign a pact in which they agree to non-aggression. The plan there is that Hitler is going to invade Poland, and Stalin agreed not to do anything about that because Stalin was going to be allowed to do some taking over of some areas himself. And so this Hitler-Stalin pact ends up being pretty controversial because Stalin's supposed to be our ally now. Is he genuinely our ally, or is he just an ally in thought only, right? So what's going to end up happening? Well, the first black box here, shortly after Hitler signed the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Germany invades Poland and started World War II. All right. And then the second black box here, the first casualty of the 1939 Hitler-Stalin non-aggression treaty was Poland. So just like in a previous slide, Poland is essentially the answer on both of these, okay? Poland is taken over, World War II starts. Why did Stalin really do this? Well, he answers that finally in 1941 when he says it may be asked how the Soviet government could have consented to conclude a non-aggression pact with such perfidious fiends as Hitler and Ribbentrop. Was this not an error on the part of the Soviet government? He says no. We secured to our country peace for a year and a half and the opportunity of preparing. I should probably hide that, for that time. Okay. So let me get in here a little bit deeper. Let's go here. All right. We're going to now modify our policy of neutrality. I'll show you this slide here. We're going to move from neutrality acts to being a little bit more willing to be more aggressive in what we're doing. So Neutrality Act 1939 is going to be a policy called cash and carry, which means that we will now trade with the Allied governments as long as they come to American ports with their ships get the supplies, and they have to pay up front for these things, which is essentially correcting another World War I mistake, right? So we're getting a little bit more willing to offer help, so to speak, right? At this point, we see that Britain is under great attack. The Battle of Britain is raging. Churchill is absolutely desperate. And because of that desperation, they're going to offer something that they're going to offer something that we wouldn't ordinarily trade. Okay, so the textbook quote you see here on your screen, it says that Roosevelt moved boldly when on September 2nd, 1940, he agreed to transfer to Great Britain 50 old Model 4 funnel destroyers left over from World War I. In return, the British promised to hand over to the United States 8 valuable defensive base sites stretching from Newfoundland to South America. So the answer to the black box is literally right there on the screen. Exchange for American destroyers, the British gave the United States 8 valuable naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. We're actually the ones that won this agreement here, but it wasn't going to be helpful to Britain to have all these naval sites around the globe, and especially in the American hemisphere, if they're going to essentially lose to Germany. So they needed the ships more than they needed these bases. So we win this thing, but at the same time, Britain gets something that they needed. Let's see here. In 1940, there is an election. The most controversial thing about the election of 1940 is, should FDR run for an unprecedented third term? Nobody in the history of the United States has ever done this. Should you do this? And FDR is basically believing at this point that America needs an experienced hand heading into what he already sees is World War II and American involvement in World War II. So he is going to run for that third term. Who are the Republicans going to run against Roosevelt? Well, they essentially ran the most inexperienced politician in the country. He's basically a counterweight. He's the opposite of FDR. FDR and many others in the country think we need somebody experienced, ready to do this thing, since we're essentially going to be involved in this war pretty soon. And the Republicans offered a man named Wendell Willkie. He was virtually unheard of. He was a rising star all of a sudden. He gave great speeches at the convention, and all of a sudden, the Republicans fell in love with him, says this is the man with the plan. But essentially, the rest of the country had never heard of him. And FDR is going to win quite handily in the election of 1940. By 1940, American public opinion had come to favor what we refer to as all aid short of war. Okay? Anything that Britain needs, anything that France needs, anything that our allies need, we will give anything except for going to war. We're trying to stay out of this war with everything that we can, and whatever. And so you see the textbook quote on the screen here. It says this. It says the underlying concept was send guns, not sons, billions, not bodies. America would be the arsenal of democracy. It would send a limitless supply of arms to the victims of aggression, who in turn would finish the job and keep the war on their side of the Atlantic. Okay, so here we are. We are now all age short of war. We've moved from complete isolationism with neutrality acts of 1935, 1936, 1937, 1938, 1939. We are going to modify that to be cash and carry. By 1940, we are all age short of war. We're going to sign the Lend-Lease Act, and the Lend-Lease Act is essentially it is us saying, whatever you need, we'll give it. Okay, just come get it. You don't have to pay for it up front. Might not even have to pay for it at all. But we want you guys to go win this war and keep Hitler over there. So we are all age short of war. Right. Then Germany is going to, in 1941, invade the Soviet Union. So what happened when that happened? All right. Whenever they invaded the Soviet Union, the United States made Lend-Lease aid available to the Soviets as well. Okay, even though they're only barely our friends, we're going to make them also have the capability of having Lend-Lease aid available to them as well. All right. So let me get into the very last part of this. Why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Okay. Let me give you some textbook quotes that will help you understand this. This is very good content from your textbook. Mr. David Kennedy says Japan's war machine was fatally dependent on immense shipments of steel, scrap iron, oil, and aviation gasoline from the United States. Washington, late 1940, finally imposed the first of its embargoes on Japan-bound supplies. Now, let me stop there for just a second. Why would we embargo? Why would we stop trade with Japan? This was our way of reprimanding Japan for atrocious acts and attacks on your Asian countries. They, at this point, had already started the process of invading Manchuria, of engaging in the rape of Nanking, of invading the coastal areas of China, and all these kind of things. They are engaged in war against our allies, and so we are going to embargo them. Now, the rest of the quote here. This blow was followed in mid-1941 by a freezing of Japanese assets in the United States and a cessation of all shipments of gasoline and other sinews of war. And as the oil gauge dropped, the squeeze on Japan grew steadily more nerve-wracking. Japanese leaders were faced with two painful alternatives. They could either knuckle under to the Americans or break out of the embargo ring by a desperate attack on the oil supplies and other riches of Southeast Asia. Now, who controls the oil supplies and riches of Southeast Asia? Those would be European countries like France, but also the fact that the United States still controlled the Philippines, which had great amounts of oil as well. So essentially what we know is going to happen now is that there's going to be an attack somewhere, okay? They're going to send diplomats to the United States to sue for peace, okay? But while they're doing that, they're also planning a war. And we already know this. We've broken Japan's secret code when it comes to their use of telegraphy, right? So we know what they're saying. We know how they're communicating. We see final tense negotiations with Japan took place in Washington during November and early December 1941. Faced with capitulation or continued conquest, they chose the sword. Officials in Washington, having cracked the top secret code of the Japanese, knew that Tokyo's decision was for war. No one in high authority in Washington seems to have believed that the Japanese were either strong enough or foolhardy enough to strike Hawaii. So the reason why Pearl Harbor ends up being a surprise attack is not because we weren't expecting the Japanese to attack. We were. It's because we were expecting them to attack somewhere else. Namely, we expected them to attack in Malaysia or the Philippines. And so we're supposedly on a high alert in Malaysia and the Philippines, expecting that attack from Japan. Instead, they made the long trip all the way to Hawaii in a way that we didn't think they were even capable of doing. And sure enough, they caught us in a very, very harsh, hardcore surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And that will, in essence, end up bringing us to the brink of American involvement in World War II. All right. So let me get to this very last one, and then I'll shut up for chapter 34. What also is going to happen? Well, while this is taking place, we're going to get involved in this war, okay? But we can also see what's happening elsewhere. And in June of 1939, what's in essence is going to happen is that there are going to be Jews who are trying to escape Germany. There are some terrible, terrible things taking place there. They're not just losing freedoms and rights. They are now being swept up and being put into concentration camps. They're being placed into places where they're going to be forced into subjection. They can't have businesses. They can't have rights. Quite honestly, there's even laws against Jews even having sex. All right. There's nothing that they can do. So the Jews are trying to escape Europe. Where are they going to go? Well, one particular ship full of Jewish refugees called the SS St. Louis landed in America June 29, 1939. What was America's response to this? American ministers, they decided that these Jews were making up the things that they were saying were taking place back home. And so these Americans are going to essentially put these guys back on a ship, send them back to Germany, where the overwhelming majority of them will die in the Holocaust. Why would America do such a thing? Quite honestly, here's where your black box comes in here. Probably the greatest obstacle to America's acceptance of more Jewish refugees from Europe was a failure of moral imagination and a belief that the Holocaust could actually be happening. We didn't think there was any way what they're describing was real. Only 5 years later were we to discover that not only were they right about what they were saying, it was way worse than we could have ever imagined. And that should give you enough foreshadowing to lend you into a conversation that we'll get into in chapter 35. All right.